What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 6 Final Look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS Week 6 main slate. And if you stay to the very end after all my picks and after I show you the Draft Dashboard tools, I'll give you my super secret sleeper pick that no one's talking about. Okay guys, before we get started, I'm going to go over the Week 6 injury report. These are players that I think have significant fantasy impact here in Week 6. Okay, these are players most likely to be out. Sammy Watkins, wide receiver from the Kansas City Chiefs. He has a hamstring injury and will most likely miss this game or be hindered. He gets 7.6 targets per game, so that means Mecole Hardman and Demarcus Robinson, the other main wide receivers on this team, will benefit from those added 7.6 targets per game. Keep an eye on Tyreek Hill, who could return this week, and that would somewhat negate this added benefit to Hardman and Robinson. Todd Gurley, running back from the LA Rams, is doubtful, which sets up Malcolm Brown to be the chalk running back value if Gurley misses. Malcolm Brown will be able to fill in for the 17 touches, 13 rush attempts, and 4 pass targets that Todd Gurley gets on average each game this season. Malcolm Brown is projected to be 16% owned based on this news, so don't forget to get your share of Malcolm Brown in case he goes off or just fills in and hits his value because he's so cheap at only $4,300 DraftKings salary and $4,800 on FanDuel. This was late news on Gurley, so the price for Malcolm Brown is as if Gurley would be playing. Okay, these players are questionable. David Johnson, the running back from Arizona Cardinals, he's questionable with a back injury. If David Johnson misses this game, you have to keep an eye on this. Or you can just log into Draft Dashboard and check the recent injury update news, or check it on your fantasy site before kickoff. Because if David Johnson is out, Chase Edmonds becomes an amazing value play for the Arizona Cardinals. Chase already had 68 yards and a touchdown while filling in for David Johnson during the Bengals game. So make sure to get some Chase Edmonds in your lineups if David Johnson is out. And it's also a bump to Larry Fitzgerald, who will become a target monster versus a bad pass defense of the Atlanta Falcons. Alvin Kamara, the stud running back from the New Orleans Saints, he popped up on the injury report and did not practice on Friday and is now questionable. If Alvin Kamara misses this game, Latavius Murray will most likely get the start at running back. So this is something to keep an eye on, as Latavius Murray could end up being a high-risk, high-reward value play at running back if Kamara is limited or out on Sunday. George Kittle, the tight end stud from the San Francisco 49ers, he wasn't on the injury report all week and then was limited practice during Friday's practice. This has the feel of a false flag, marking him questionable to throw a wrinkle in the opposing team's game planning, but it's something to keep an eye on because Austin Hooper and Zach Ertz have the same upside as Kittle and they are right around the same DFS salary. So if Kittle is out, plug in Hooper or Ertz into your lineups and you should be good to go. Okay, so that's the Week 6 injury report, so let's get into this final look. This is NFL Week 6 DraftKings and FanDuel final look at the quarterback position. So you can never forget about Patrick Mahomes. It looks like he's going to be fine for this game. There's an implied total of 55.5 points in this game, with Kansas City favored by 4. So if Patrick Mahomes is out there and healthy, he should put up plenty of fantasy points in this game. And the other stud I like, who's got a great matchup, is Lamar Jackson from the Baltimore Ravens playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Lamar Jackson is averaging 26.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He's going to be about 14% owned. He's in a great spot for a bounce back week. He only had 14 fantasy points last week, but he's projected at 23.6 fantasy points here in week 6. He's $6,900 DraftKings salary and $1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Baltimore Ravens up by 10.5. So, home game for Lamar Jackson, high game total, great matchup, bounce back week. So I think he's a great stud pick here in week 6. So I like Lamar Jackson here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, coming down from those two high-priced studs, I keep going back to these two quarterbacks in a high-scoring game, both of them giving up a ton of fantasy points to the quarterback and wide receiver position. So these plays could be a lot of bang for your buck. I like Kyler Murray from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Atlanta Falcons, who give up the 4th most fantasy points overall and give up the 2nd most fantasy points to the quarterback position. Kyler Murray is averaging 21.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 25 fantasy points last week versus the Bengals. He's got a better matchup this week. He's going to be about 8% owned. He rushes the ball 5.6 times per game. He got 10 rushes last game, and I think that's going to come into play versus a bad rush defense in the Atlanta Falcons. Kyler Murray is projected at 20.8 fantasy points here in week 6. He's $6,500 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. This is a home game for Kyler Murray. He looked like he was getting going last week. I think that momentum continues here in a great matchup. So I like Kyler Murray here versus the Atlanta Falcons. And on the other side of the ball, I like Matt Ryan from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Arizona Cardinals, who give up the 2nd most fantasy points overall and the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matt Ryan has averaged 26.1 fantasy points per game on the season. He's been super consistent. He exploded for 36 fantasy points last week. He's going to be about 13% owned, projected at 24.6 fantasy points here in week 6. He's going to be $6,400 DraftKings salary and $1,700 more on FanDuel. Great matchup for Matt Ryan. He's got all his weapons at his disposal. Julio Jones, Austin Hooper, Mohamed Sanu. He should have a great game this week. So I like Matt Ryan here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Okay, so after thinking about all the quarterbacks in week 6, I was trying to pull out my favorite sleeper quarterback pick, some guy that's under 3% owned and a somewhat low salary. And I've landed on Jimmy Garoppolo from the San Francisco 49ers versus the LA Rams, who have the 9th worst defense overall and give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jimmy Garoppolo has only averaged 15.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 15 fantasy points last week. He had a 24 a few games ago. He rushes the ball 4 times per game on average. So this is a guy that can find the end zone with his legs. Jimmy Garoppolo is only going to be about 2% owned. So that's super low ownership on a guy that's got tremendous upside. This is a really good offensive San Francisco team. He's projected at 16.4 fantasy points here in week 6. He's $5,700 DraftKings salary and $1,500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points in this game, and they have this game within a field goal. So a competitive game for Garoppolo, high scoring total, pretty decent matchup here. The Rams have given up a lot of yards. So I like Jimmy Garoppolo here versus the LA Rams. Okay guys, it's time to announce the winner of our $100 weekly comment contest. And the winner is Chris Brown. Chris Brown, I'm not joking guys, the name was Chris Brown. There's so many jokes I could make right now. But Chris Brown, you are the winner of this week's $100 comment contest. Congratulations! Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And then we'll send you $100 PayPal.
So it's that easy,
and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video.
So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, FanDuel and DraftKings, Week 6, final look at the running back position. I think you gotta pay up for Ezekiel Elliott this week. From the Dallas Cowboys playing the New York Jets, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing running backs. Ezekiel Elliott has scored 18 fantasy points per game on the season, consistent producer. He got 17 fantasy points last week, 18 the game before that, and 19 the game before that. He gets an average of 17 rush attempts per game and 3.4 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 11% owned, projected at 19.6 fantasy points here in Week 6. He's $8,500 DraftKings salary and the same price on FanDuel. So nice FanDuel price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points in this game, and they've got Dallas ahead by a touchdown. So we expect Dallas to be up for the majority of this game, which could mean a nice running game script for the Dallas Cowboys and Ezekiel Elliott. He could get a ton of work this game, so I like Ezekiel Elliott here versus the New York Jets. Now don't forget about Dalvin Cook. He's been electric so far this season, averaging 27.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He does have a tough matchup versus the fourth best defense versus running backs in the Philadelphia Eagles this week, but it's a home game for Dalvin Cook, and so far this guy looks like he might be matchup proof. He's projected to be 11% owned, so have a little bit of Dalvin Cook. Don't let this guy burn you. I really liked Alvin Kamara at the start of the week, but that questionable status is really scaring me off. One of my favorite running back plays of the week is Leonard Fournette from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the New Orleans Saints, who have the 12th worst defense overall, and they're pretty good against opposing running backs. But Leonard Fournette has averaged 19.3 fantasy points per game on the season. He is on fire. 27 fantasy points last game, 30 fantasy points the game before that, averaging 19 rush attempts per game and 6 pass targets per game. He's going to be one of the chalk running backs this week, 21% owned, projected at 18.2 fantasy points here in Week 6, $6,700 DraftKings salary, and $600 more on FanDuel. So I like Leonard Fournette here versus the New Orleans Saints. Mark Ingram has a fantastic matchup and a nice running game script versus the Cincinnati Bengals. The Baltimore Ravens are favored by 10.5, so it could be a lot of goal line carries and a lot of work for Mark Ingram. He's going to be about 11% owned. Fantastic matchup. He got 19 rush attempts last week, so if he can get 20 plus rush attempts on the ground, you should see a great score at a great fantasy price for this guy. So I like Mark Ingram here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. And I haven't been able to come off a Le'Veon Bell from the New York Jets playing the Dallas Cowboys, who, yes, they are the 6th best defense overall, but they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So nice positional matchup here for Le'Veon Bell. It's a home game, and he's averaging 17.8 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets 17.8 rush attempts per game and 8 pass targets per game. He's going to be the chalk, 29% owned. He's projected at 19.5 fantasy points here in Week 6. He's only $6,400 DraftKings salary and $400 more on FanDuel. So I like Le'Veon Bell here versus the Dallas Cowboys. There's a lot of good running backs in this 6,000 salary range, like Derrick Henry from the Tennessee Titans playing the Denver Broncos, who have the 8th best defense overall, but they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Derrick Henry has scored 17.3 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 14 fantasy points last game, 15 the game before that, 12 the game before that. He's a consistent producer, averaging 19.6 rush attempts per game on the season. That's one of the most in the league. He's only going to be about 3% owned. He's on the field for 58% of the snaps and touches the ball 56% of that time. He's projected at 14.2 fantasy points here in week 6. He's $6,100 DraftKings salary and $600 more on FanDuel. They've got this game close between Tennessee and Denver, so I like Derrick Henry here versus the Denver Broncos. In another couple of low-owned running backs that I like in week 6, Matt Breida had a 31-point game last game. He's in that high-powered San Francisco offense, so he could get a lot of work around the goal line. He's only $5,100 DraftKings salary, $800 more on FanDuel. He averages 13 rush attempts per game, 2 targets per game, and he's only going to be about 3% owned, even coming off of that big 31-point game last week. He's averaging 15.7 fantasy points per game on the season, projected at 11.2 fantasy points here in week 6. There's a nice 50.5 game total by Vegas on this game, competitive game within 3. So this guy could be going overlooked after having a big game last game, people thinking it was a one-hit wonder, but I think there's more consistency to this guy than most people give him credit for. I'm not going to have a ton of this guy in my lineups, but I'll sprinkle him in. I like Matt Breida here versus the LA Rams. But the guy that I'm more interested in at just a little bit more ownership is Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have the 10th worst defense overall and give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Joe Mixon has averaged only 9.8 fantasy points per game on the season, so that's scaring a lot of people off of this play. He gets an average of 13.2 rushes per game and 3.2 targets per game, but he's got 15 the last 2 games and then 19 rush attempts the last game. So 15 to 19 rush attempts in the last 3 games, way over his season average of 13.2. So this guy is trending in the right direction. It looked like he was going to have a huge game last week. It didn't end up being the case, but this guy is just ready to pop. Only 6% owned, on the field for 54% of the snaps, touches the ball 44% of that time. He's projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in week 6. He's only $5,500 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. There's a big 47.5 total in this game, and a lot of people are scared of this play because the Bengals are supposed to be behind by 10.5. So if they're behind and trying to pass the ball to catch up, that's not going to favor Joe Mixon. But I think they get him involved early. I think the Bengals can keep this game somewhat competitive throughout to keep Joe Mixon on the field. So I like Joe Mixon here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Okay guys, if you're getting any value from this video, please hit that red subscribe button. We put out new fantasy football videos every day. So if you hit that subscribe button and ring that bell notification, you won't miss out on any of our new fantasy football videos. Tons of free stuff coming your way. It only takes a second, and it helps us push out more fantasy football content for you guys to consume each and every day. It's because of you subscribers that make this possible. So thank you for supporting this channel. Okay, DraftKings and FanDuel, Week 6, final look at the wide receiver position. So at the top, you're going to have to pay up for these guys. Julio Jones and Michael Thomas, both of these wide receiving studs have great matchups this week. They're both about the same salary. You'll probably be able to play one or the other unless you really go studs and scrubs, but they're both in great spots. Julio Jones is projected at 17% ownership and Michael Thomas at 11%. So I like both these wide receiver plays. Julio Jones looks to be in the better spot in a game that's projected to have 51.5 total points. And he's got a great matchup versus the second worst defense in the league in the Arizona Cardinals. but Michael Thomas exploded last week for 44 fantasy points. I'm just worried that he's going to have a down week after a ceiling game. I'll still have some Michael Thomas. I prefer Julio Jones as the stud this week, even though he's let us down the last 2 weeks. He's got that 30-point upside, and it might just come in this game versus Arizona. So I like Julio Jones here versus the Arizona Cardinals, and I like Michael Thomas here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, if you want a nice pivot play to save some salary, take a look at Cooper Kupp from the LA Rams playing the San Francisco 49ers. Look, the 49ers defense is good. They're the third best defense overall, but they're only middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Cooper Kupp has scored 25.6 fantasy points per game on the season. This guy's game log is crazy. 30 fantasy points last week, 30 the week before that, 36 the week before that. He's on fire, averaging 12.6 targets per week. He got 17 targets last game. He's going to be about 12% owned. He's projected at 18.8 fantasy points here in week 6, and he's 7,100 DraftKings salary and 700 more on FanDuel. There's a high total in this game as well, 50.5 points, a close game. They've got the Rams by 3, a home game for the Rams. So I like Cooper Kupp here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, coming down to the mid-range wide receivers. One of my favorite plays this week is Larry Fitzgerald from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the third worst defense overall and give up the absolute most fantasy points to the opposing wide receiver position. Larry Fitzgerald has scored 16.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 12 fantasy points last game. We were hoping that he'd find the end zone to bust it open, but he's getting 8.8 targets per game, so plenty of opportunity. The injury to David Johnson could help his target count this week. If they look to give David Johnson a little relief, it could come in the way of Larry Fitzgerald, who's going to be about 15% owned, on the field for 88% of the snaps. He's always out there, big part of this offense. He's projected at 15.5 fantasy points here in week 6. He's 6,100 DraftKings salary and 500 less on FanDuel. So an absolute smash FanDuel price. The big 51.5 total in this game, competitive game, home game for Fitzgerald. Fantastic matchup. Kyler Murray's been making good decisions with the ball. So I like Larry Fitzgerald here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Now, right around the same price, this guy is a sleeper pick who I think's going overlooked this week. I like Terry McLaurin from the Washington Redskins playing the Miami Dolphins, who are the absolute worst defense overall and give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Terry McLaurin has averaged 17.7 fantasy points per game on the season. That's a big number. He's getting 7.8 targets per game, and he's only going to be about 1% owned. He's on the field for 96% of the snaps and touches the ball 13% of that time. He's projected for 13.8 fantasy points here in week 6. He's 6,000 DraftKings salary and 400 more on FanDuel. So this is a terrible Miami defense, a capable quarterback. Terry McLaurin gets a ton of targets. So I like Terry McLaurin here versus the Miami Dolphins. Now, coming down in salary a little bit, I like Michael Gallup from the Dallas Cowboys playing the New York Jets, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall and give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Michael Gallup has averaged 22 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 27 fantasy points last week, averaging 9.7 targets per game. He got 14 targets last week. He's only going to be about 6% owned, projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in week 6. He's 5,600 DraftKings salary and 500 more on FanDuel. So I like Michael Gallup here versus the New York Jets. And the other two guys you can't forget about are DJ Chark and Dede Westbrook from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the New Orleans Saints. who have the 12th worst defense overall and give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. This is a home game for the Jaguars. They've looked pretty good with Gardner Minshew, who's another sleeper quarterback pick that I think should be considered this week. He's a nice stack with DJ Chark or Dede Westbrook or both of these guys. Chark's going to be about 12% owned, Dede Westbrook about 8% owned, right around the same salary, $5,000 to $5,500. I'm leaning a little bit towards Dede Westbrook at the lower ownership, thinking that they're going to try to shut down DJ Chark, who's coming off of a 39 fantasy point game last week, which might open things up for Dede Westbrook. So I like both of these guys, but favoring Dede Westbrook here versus the New Orleans Saints. Okay, moving way down in salary, these are some low salary, high risk, high reward type players. I like Preston Williams from the Miami Dolphins playing the Washington Redskins, who are the 3rd worst defense overall and give up the 2nd most fantasy points to the opposing wide receiver position. Preston Williams has averaged 10.3 fantasy points per game on the season. He's been a consistent producer, averaging 7.5 targets per game. He's only going to be about 4% owned, projected at 11.1 fantasy points here in week 6. He's only $4,100 DraftKings salary and $1,500 more on FanDuel. So I like Preston Williams here in a great matchup versus the Washington Redskins. And the other guy, this guy could be played in a stack with Larry Fitzgerald and Kyler Murray. I like Keyshawn Johnson from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Atlanta Falcons. So we know the Falcons have a bad defense. They give up the absolute most fantasy points overall to the wide receiver position. Keyshawn Johnson, he's averaging 5.2 targets per game, 6 points per game. He's only going to be about 3% owned. He got 7 targets last game. Just keep an eye on Christian Kirk. If he comes back, that may diminish the role of Keyshawn Johnson, but he should be out there for plenty of snaps, get plenty of looks. It's a fantastic matchup. A total of 51.5 points in this game. Home game. So I like Keyshawn Johnson here versus the Atlanta Falcons.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, DFS, week 6. This is the final look at the tight end position. Okay guys, so the update here is that George Kittle is now questionable after being limited in Friday's practice. So if they activate him, I think he's good to go. Just keep an eye on that. But I like Zach Ertz, George Kittle, and Austin Hooper as my top 3 tight ends this week. They're all around the same salary, so you can plug in any one of those guys. If George Kittle is out, go with Zach Ertz or Austin Hooper. I'm favoring Austin Hooper, who's got that fantastic matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals, who give up the most fantasy points in the league to the tight end position. Austin Hooper is averaging 17.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.4 targets per game. He's going to be about 31% owned, so he's the tight end chalk this week, but I think it's chalk you want to eat. He should be able to pay off this $5,000 salary price tag. He's $1,400 more on FanDuel, projected at 14.2 fantasy points here in week 6. We keep talking about it, but that huge 51.5 game total that Vegas thinks is going to be scored in this game, that's a lot of fantasy points. In a close game, just 2.5 point spread, that makes for a lot of fantasy production, so I like Austin Hooper here versus the Arizona Cardinals. If you want to come off of the Austin Hooper chalk, you got Will Dissly, who's been pretty productive this season, 14.8 fantasy points per game on the season. He's been on fire. 5.2 targets per game, but he's made the most of them. He's projected at 11.7 fantasy points here in week 6. He's $4,900 DraftKings salary and $1,100 more on FanDuel. So I like Will Dissly as a nice pivot play off the chalk. And don't forget about Mark Andrews, who's been questionable for like 3 weeks in a row. He's been playing and productive. He's playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. He's putting up 16.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting 7.8 targets per game, and he's kept that consistent for the past 3 weeks, even during this questionable tag. So don't read much into that tag. He's going to be about 19% owned. He's projected at 11.7 fantasy points here in week 6. 47.5 points total in this game. They got the Baltimore Ravens ahead by 10.5. So I like Mark Andrews here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. And if you're really struggling for salary and you want a low salary tight end with some upside, take a look at Gerald Everett from the LA Rams. And yeah, they're playing the San Francisco 49ers, who got a great defense, only giving up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. But Gerald Everett, he scored 24 fantasy points last week, 15 the game before that. He got 8 and 11 targets in those games, averaging about 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He's going to be about 6% owned, projected at 8.2 fantasy points here in week 6. He's only $3,600 DraftKings salary and $2,400 more on FanDuel. So I love that DraftKings price. High total game, 50.5 points should be scored in this game. Competitive game within 3, a home game. So I like Gerald Everett here versus the San Francisco 49ers.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. You've unlocked the bonus content.
My super secret sleeper pick for week 6. Okay, he's not a sleeper pick, but he's a low salary running back that I don't want you guys to forget about. It's Malcolm Brown from the LA Rams playing the San Francisco 49ers. Remember, Todd Gurley is doubtful for this game. It's not a sleeper pick because he's projected to be 16% owned based on that news. But it is an amazing value that it's opened up here at the running back position, and I didn't want you guys to forget about it. He's projected at 7.1 fantasy points here this week. There's supposed to be 50.5 points scored in this game, a close game within 3. Malcolm Brown should get plenty of work. Don't go crazy on this guy. He could very easily bust, but get your share of him. If you want a real sleeper pick here at the running back position, take a look at these guys: Kenyon Drake, Latavius Murray if Kamara misses, and Adrian Peterson with a plus matchup versus the Miami Dolphins.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite
player for this NFL slate.
I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.